You know that horrible sinking feeling when you feel like you've done something incredibly stupid? Well, that happened to me about 2 months ago when I was driving my beloved brother-in-law's beautiful red Jetta in Oakland, California, and my attention lapsed for a moment as I picked up speed, leaving a stop sign in the middle of an intersection. And my attention did not return until I was about 6 inches away from the side back bumper of someone else's car. And when I slammed on the brakes, of course, it was way too late. And I twirled their car around a little bit and totally messed up the bumper of Todd's car. That's my brother-in-law. And license plate went to one side and bumper went to the other side. And, thank God nobody was really hurt. And I wasn't actually going that fast. But I felt so bad because I know how much my brother-in-law loves his car. And I also like to think of myself as a careful person and especially a careful user of someone else's property. And after all the necessary steps were completed of exchanging license plates and insurance and everything like that, I kind of was able to drive the car home, but really felt like I was slinking home. And I felt so ashamed of myself. And I realized that I felt wrong for having that accident, and not only wrong, but wrong for being wrong. And I realized that I was seeing this mistake as like a verdict on my carefulness or my seriousness or my caring as a sister-in-law. And of course, as a safety researcher and someone who studies learning from accident and error, I was quite fascinated to note that I really saw this mistake as a crime, at least temporarily. So this week, we're going to explore this idea of feeling wrong for being wrong and how do we destigmatize failure. Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph, organizational behavior scholar, interested in everything that gets in the way of our being productive, kind, connected humans, and all the things that help us be connected, kind, productive humans. We're going to continue exploring how do we build psychological safety for our teams this week. And we're going to explore how to manage errors and mistakes when we make them. Because I don't know about you, but if you are somewhat of a perfectionist like I can be, sometimes very painful to mess up. And yet what we've learned from the research on learning in organizations and creating psychological safety is that we have to destigmatize that kind of failure. And that's what we're going to talk about. Before we do, I want to put this in the larger context of the work we've been doing. And that is following Amy Edmondson's ideas from her wonderful book, The Fearless Organization, about how do we create psychological safety on the teams we work in. And we've been using something she calls the leader's toolkit. And what she argues is if we want to consistently create psychological safety, learning, and effectiveness on our teams, we as leaders or followers who are trying to manage up need to do the following things. So one is we need to set the stage for the work, and that has to do with clarifying what is the purpose of the work and framing the work in terms of how do we do it, what are the expectations, and so on. And when we do that stage setting well, what Amy Edmondson argues is that we can create shared expectations and shared meaning for what we're doing. The second thing that she talks about is how we invite participation as an effective leader or as a follower trying to influence up. And one of the big things she emphasizes is demonstrating situational humility, which is how do I, as the leader, project some confidence, yet also invite input with the idea that I only have one perspective and I might be missing someone. Inviting participation also, she argues, requires practicing really good inquiry. And how do we invite people to share? What kinds of questions do we use? Open-ended questions. And also modeling being interested and actually listening. And then the last piece of inviting participation that she talks about is setting structures for that. So, for example, we have a really rigid but effective structure often when we are resuscitating a patient. We want to start chest compressions. We want to make sure to breathe for the patient. We want to give certain drugs in a certain order, and then we want to check for a pulse again. It's a very specific structure. And yet we expect ourselves constantly to manage complex processes, such as a planning meeting with almost no structure, maybe an agenda that lists some topics, but not how we're going to do it. So previously on the podcast, we talked about how do you build those structures in so people know how to participate and feel psychologically safe to participate. And then the last piece that Amy Edmondson talks about in the Leader's Toolkit for creating psychological safety on our teams is responding productively. So you've set the stage, you've invited participation, but then when people participate, how do you actually respond? And not surprisingly, often expressing appreciation is a great way to respond if someone takes the risk to speak up. Listening is a good way to respond. And so finally, today, we're going to talk about the last piece of responding productively, which is how do we manage accidents, errors, preventable failure? As we think about destigmatizing failure, I think many of us would think in our kind of grounded, resourceful, intellectual selves, like, of course we have to destigmatize failure. You know, I've read about growth mindset from the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford University, and I know that seeing small mistakes and errors as an opportunity for learning is a really good thing, and that's how I get better. I know that. I know that as an athlete. I know that as someone who's trying to learn how to do West Coast swing. I know that as someone who's gets feedback from reviewers when I send in publications. But there's a part of me in my heart of hearts that often feels like a sinner when I make a mistake. And so I just wanted to juxtapose the idea that I think intellectually, many of us recognize that failure is an important part of learning, or preventable error is an important part of learning, and this other part of ourselves that wants to be perfect and experiences shame when we're not. The reason I want to highlight this is a lot of the really great ideas out there, like growth mindset, or, for example, the idea of creating business models that can fail fast, or, as Amy Edmondson covers in her newer book, The Right Kind of Wrong, studied or planned failure is crucial to building a rocket ship that can go to the moon. Planned failure is crucial to discovering whether your new business model for a course that you want to sell is something somebody actually wants to buy. Those are absolutely good values and right values, but I think they clash often with this internal feeling that I'm only a good person if I get it right. Moving from thinking of ourselves as criminals when we make a mistake, and I know it seems ridiculous to say that I kind of felt like a criminal when I bashed my brother-in-law's car, but I felt truly bad. I really was, there was a few moments there I was really flooded with shame. And I think to move beyond that and be able to learn from even a small fender bender like that or other things, we have to reframe what it is we think about ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. And Amy Edmondson provides some guidance on that in The Fearless Organization, as she talks about how do we destigmatize failure. And what she talks about is the traditional way that each one of us tends to frame mistakes or failures is A, failure is not acceptable, which I certainly experienced in my little fender bender. And the second thing, and I absolutely believe this sometimes, even though it doesn't help me, is effective performers don't fail. Like a good driver, a loyal sister-in-law wouldn't bash my brother-in-law's car. And the goal, of course, is to prevent failure. The problem with these frames, says Amy Edmondson, is that we tend to want to hide our failures or protect myself when I've made a mistake. Like I don't want to disclose it because I feel ashamed about it. So as we go to destigmatizing failure, we need to think about what's a way to reframe that? How do I make the leap from I'm a bad person for having made this mistake to I'm human, I made a mistake, what can I learn from it? I'm pausing again, James, because I realize I don't really have this leap thought out yet. Let's just discuss for a second, James. I think I can be in the mindset of it's okay to make mistakes. I'm going to learn from these mistakes. It's only human to make mistakes, modeling fallibility, all that stuff. But that journey from when I am kind of deep in, like, I'm not a good person for having made this mistake, to getting to that zone of I'm an okay person, even though I made a mistake. That's where I'm a little vague right now. What are the different things that people do, I do, what is written? Do you have any thoughts on what you've seen there or what you think about there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one element of this is, and I imagine as a listener or even a skeptical listener saying, it's one thing to say, oh, we learn from mistakes, but also you can't excuse all mistakes by saying, oh, it's just something I'm going to learn from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Accountability requires what are you going to do differently next time? So it's one thing to say, like, oh, I got in a little fender bender, but mistakes happen. I'll learn from this. But you also have to sort of do the work, right? Of
Right.
what are you going to do differently next time? It's not enough to say I'll learn from it. You have to be concrete in what you are going to do. What did you do wrong? Not at the level of shame, I'm a bad person, inferences about your character, but at the level of data. Like I took my eyes off the road because I was thinking about X or Y and Z. When
Absolutely.
I'm driving, I should make sure to, not do A or B or C.
Yeah. So that's such a great point, James. And actually, something like that is exactly what happened because my brother-in-law has a car that's different from mine. And the setup of where the fan goes off and on and the heat adjustment goes up and down. And I was adjusting and playing around with those things and starting to drive away from the stop sign. And after the fender bender, when I came back home to Massachusetts and I was driving my own car, I realized that there was so much automatic knowledge I had about where everything is in my car and what I can do simultaneously and not do simultaneously. And I had this like for a couple of weeks when I got home, a good kind of slightly anxious feeling like I can't take for granted all these things that I can do automatically because that's what got me in trouble. And that's what got me into that fender bender. So what I really like about your point is it's not only about reframing like I'm not a bad person, but it's also about the concrete aspects of what are you going to change and what are you going to do differently. And taking some accountability for doing those things. So, what I want to say about accountability is I kind of want to talk about a continuum of you're a bad person for making a mistake versus you need to take responsibility for making a mistake, versus the high end of that continuum, which is like, oh, well, laissez-faire, who cares? That's probably not the end of the continuum many of us would want to be on. What I've noticed as I work with clinical educators over the last many years, 15 years or so, is there's a definite subset of us who, in certain circumstances, believe that when other people make mistakes of a certain sort, it is a moral failure and should be sanctioned. And the reason this comes up in these educational contexts is sometimes when I'm working with people and asking them to kind of open up how they feel about the mistake that their learner made, and recognize, hey, that person didn't wake up this morning wanting to kill patients. That person is worthy of you holding the assumption that they were trying to do the right thing. I'll often get pushback in those conversations from these educators and say, if I don't let them know that I think this is really wrong, I'm worried they're going to do it again. And so I think for each one of us, as we try to learn from accident and error, we have to titrate and balance and come up with the right recipe and mixture of accountability for ourselves, grace for ourselves, and a pathway to improve it. Any thoughts there, James, in terms of what you were talking about?
Yeah, I think that titration is exactly the trick of it. And it's really truly difficult to know what the right point is for any individual person. Just because for some people it may be you don't need to say anything, they're going to do the work or they're going to beat themselves up. And for some people it truly may be if you don't say something, they will never think about this again.
Yeah,
And
I
so
love
and
that.
and
Yep.
so it's tough to make that titration. I know thinking about my experience or things that I've seen, I can think about people who have said things like, I made a mistake, I'm going to learn from it, I'm going to take time to grow. And I go, I don't believe you.
Mm, mm-hmm,
What are
mm-hmm.
you going to do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that is a great point, James. And I think we need to think about that for ourselves. What is the right recipe of grace and accountability for ourselves? And then we need to think about that when we're trying to influence friends, colleagues, loved ones, manage up, manage down, whatever it might be. Um, so, to that point, James, part of the way that I understand this titration came from some work that I did under the tutelage of the MIT Sloan professor John Carroll, who I got to work with many years ago when I was a doctoral student and a research assistant on a 5-year project that he was doing, studying learning from accident and error in nuclear power plants. And this process was absolutely definitional to my understanding of framing of error and how we approach it. And I'm going to talk about the 4 stages that we found, and I'm going to put them in the context of how do you mix and match blame, shame, accountability, grace, curiosity. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet is being rigorous about what are you learning from the accident or error that happened. So, what John Carroll and I did was we reviewed tens of accident reports from 4 different nuclear power plants, and we coded them qualitatively on a variety of dimensions about learning and organizational change. And what we found was 4 different approaches to learning from accident and error. One of them we called the local approach, which tended to be reliant on the local power plants, leaders, values, and personalities didn't tend to benchmark as much against national standards, but most importantly, tended to take an approach of sort of denying and punishing mistakes. And so people who made mistakes could get fired, people who made mistakes could get sanctioned. And there didn't seem to be a process for these kinds of plants of how they were going to actually learn from these events. The second type of approach to accident and error that we discovered was what we call the constrained or controlling approach. And this is much more common, I think, for many of us, even if we're not running a nuclear power plant. And that is, we want ourselves or other people to comply with the rules as written. And when compliance is off, we need to close that compliance gap. And generally, the way to do that is to fix the symptoms of that miscompliance, which would be add training or a not a heavy sanction, but a kind of slap on the wrist type thing that says, you shouldn't do that. In both of these first two approaches to learning from accident and error in nuclear power, and I think if we extrapolate to each of our personal lives, this kind of deny and punish, or work and comply with the rules and fix anything that causes the deviations. The underlying frame with respect to error is that errors are a crime. Or if you don't want to say it that strongly, errors are not acceptable. And they could almost represent a moral failure. So in my approach to debriefing, I've often talked about harsh, hidden, and good judgment. And some of what I ended up writing about in that emerged from this work that we did in nuclear power plants, because what I found was harsh judgment often doesn't work that well. And that was sort of what characterized these local and controlled approaches to nuclear power learning. The third approach we found, John Carroll and I called the open approach, which had some good aspects, which was benchmarking against the best, communicating as openly as you could about what happened. But what we discovered is that these nuclear power plant investigations and leaders couldn't find a good way to talk about the hard stuff, like the fact that an error had been made and that something did need to be changed. So in their desire to move away from the shame and blame approach that they rightly detected was not working in these other typical approaches to nuclear power plant accidents and errors, they kind of swung too far to the nicey nice side, what I sometimes call the hidden judgment side, like they had a judgment, but they couldn't find a way to talk about it. And the problem with these plants was, even though they moved away from the shame and blame approach, they still really struggled to learn from their accidents and errors because they couldn't talk about them in a rigorous, deep way. And then finally, what John Carroll and I found was that the plants that learned the best and the most and sustained those safety gains and changes used a model we called deep learning, which combined what I later came to call high standards for safety and high regard for people. And so these plants successfully were able to, for example, dig into what specifically led to the accident. Not only what did people do, but how were people thinking about it? And at the same time, managed in their interviews with people to treat them in a way that people felt like they were respected and that they were trying to do something good that day. They didn't wake up trying to harm the nuclear power plant. And that combination of high standards and high regard, essentially something like the basic assumption that they're intelligent, capable, trying to do their best and want to improve, allowed the plants to deeply understand what had gone wrong. And then, because people were treated with respect in the process, collaborate to develop corrective action plans that were actually implementable. So the mixture I see here that moves a person like me who can sort of over own my mistakes and or feel extra super bad about them, to being a person who can accept and learn from those mistakes, requires holding on to the standard for what is actually acceptable behavior and giving yourself a little bit of grace. Our workout of the week asks you to reframe a mistake that you or someone else made in a way that productively allows you to learn from it. So how do you move yourself from shame and blame for yourself or shame and blame for that other person to a more forgiving stance that still holds yourself or someone else to high standards, but holds yourself or that other person in high regard and gives yourself some grace? So reframe a mistake you made or you saw someone else make in a productive way. Thank you for joining me here in Curious Now. Curious Now is produced at the Center for Medical Simulation in Boston by James Lipshaw, our director. Look forward to seeing you next week.